Inside your W12 D1 workbook, let's go to the A&P test, Anatomy and Physiology test, and work with the data provided there. So the first thing I want you to note is that the format of our data is a little bit different. This is what we call the long format. All of our exam scores are recorded in a single column, and we distinguish between which exam scores come from an exercise science major or a nursing major using a separate variable, which we call major. Contrast this against our Labradors and Basset Hounds example, where these measurements, whether we're in column A or column B, these are still dog weights, but we've broken them up. We've kind of pre-filtered them, so all the lab weights are in one column and all of the Basset Hound weights are in a different column. So these are two different formats, and you have to work with them differently. And as I mentioned in the previous example, the visualization and the t.test command require us to be in this wide format. So if we're doing this kind of analysis in Excel, we're going to have to know how to possibly change from our long format into this wide format. And I'm going to show you how to do that. The one benefit of the long format is that it works a little bit nicer with the pivot tables, which I'm going to demonstrate first. So here's our setup. We have test scores for the most recent anatomy and physiology exam. We're interested in whether the nursing majors have the same mean score as the exercise science majors. Right? So in other words, is there a difference between the types of students that are attracted to these different majors? We're going to test the claim that there's no difference. The mean is equal. Our first question's to the right. Using a pivot table, generate a table that looks at means, standard deviations, and sample sizes broken up by major on the columns. Okay? So inserting the pivot table is the same as we usually do. We select all of our data. A nice Command or Control A will do this quickly. We go to the Insert tab in the ribbon, and we hit Pivot Table. Inside of that dialog box, we want to go into Existing Worksheet, and then we're just going to click where we want the top of our pivot table to be. In this case, it's right below our question number 1. So we're going to hit OK. Now, keep in mind, the exam scores is a quantitative column. So if we pull exam scores anywhere, it's going to be in the values box. Major is a categorical column, which is distinguishing which scores comes from an exercise science major versus a nursing major. And these go into either the columns or the row boxes. This is a little review from Unit 1. Now, according to the problem, we want to put the major on the columns. So we're going to drag this major variable into the columns, and we're going to take the exam scores and we're going to drag it into the values column. So currently what it's doing is it's looking at the sum of the exam scores. So what we want to do is instead take a look at means. So we would change this to average. And we can see down this first setup here, the exercise science students had an average of 71.6, whereas nursing had an average of 74.2. Now we want to add more of these, right? We also want to look at standard deviations and sample sizes. So to do that, as we did in the last case, we're going to take that quantitative variable and just keep dragging it into the values so that we have columns going across for each one. So if we want the standard deviations, we'll summarize by stdev. And if we want our sample sizes, we'll summarize by count. And you can see this is kind of a long way to format it. So maybe what I would do instead is move my values over to the rows rather than the columns. And you can see that you'll get a table that looks a little bit nicer, right? First of all, your exercise science is treated as your first column. Your nursing is treated as your second column. And we can see that there's a big difference between how many exercise science students took this quiz versus nursing students. 46 nursing students were in this class, was only 13 exercise science. We can see a difference in means, and we can see that the standard deviations are roughly the same. Okay, so sometimes when it looks like it's sorting this out value-wise across all of your columns, the way that you fix this is you see this little values inside of the columns. You want to pull this over to the rows, and it's just going to kind of stack the summaries that you've set up here by row. So now you have the type of major by column, the summaries by row, and we have a nice table for these descriptive statistics on the samples that we've collected. Problem 2 asks us to use the space below to convert the data into short or what I might call wide format. In other words, we want a single column for all the nursing scores and a new column for all the exercise science scores. The way we're going to do this is I'm going to show you how to apply a filter to a collection of scores like this. So once again, highlight all of your data and go over to the upper left. Remember when we wanted to sort our a sample of scores in a particular order? We went to this little sort button up here. It has a funnel and an A to a Z. We're going to skip over all the sort options and go to something called filter. So if we click that filter button, you'll notice the only thing that's really changed is we now have this little drop-down box sitting at the top of our column names. And so what we can do with that drop-down box is we can decide to sort the entire table based on a condition for this single column. So what we can do with this is just say, well, why don't we sort the entire table or the entire collection of data so that the major is in ascending order. And what that'll do is it'll group all of our exercise science majors into the first looks like 14, or no, 13, sorry, we started A2. The first 13 cells. And then all of the nursing majors end up coming below. So by sorting the data, it's very easy for me to just highlight, copy, and paste to create my wide format or my short format. Quick trick with the nursing one so you don't have to click and drag. Just click into the first measurement, and then remember, hold your Control Shift down or Command Shift down, and this will automatically take you to the bottom of the row. Now you can copy that, Command C or Control C, click into the top of the nursing scores, and then paste or hit Control or Command V. All right. So rewind the video if that went a little bit too fast, but the idea is you want to take your original data, you want to sort it by applying a filter first, and then you select major, and you can put it in descending or ascending order, it doesn't matter. You want to group the exercise science measurements and then and the nursing measurements, and then you're just going to do a copy and paste. All right, so we now officially have a wide format or a short format, just like we had for the Labradors and Bassets example. Now that we have this, comparative box plots and hypothesis testing are sort of primed to work very easily. So what we'll notice is if we select our wide format or our short format data for nursing and exercise science scores, we can go directly to Insert, and we can insert our box and whisker plot to get a visualization of the differences here. When you select with the column titles, here's kind of a fun little thing. You can actually add a legend. Maybe I'll put it at the bottom, right? This inside a chart design, you can go to Add Chart Element, Legend, put it on the bottom, and it'll actually show you which one is which, nursing scores versus exercise science scores. So let me zoom into this a little bit so you can take a look. And what we see here, by investigating the visual box plot, it seems like nursing scores are a little bit higher typically, but, in the middle 50% anyways. But is it really different enough to conclude that at the population level, right, for, say, all nursing majors or all exercise science majors taking the same exam, would the nursing majors tend to do better? Okay. So this is our sample information, and we have our sample summaries up here. Now, to make a claim about the population level, we need to run the hypothesis test. So we're going to start with a significance level of 8%, which means the alpha value that we're going to compare this against in the end is 8%. Remember, to compute our p-value, we pretty much just need to write out what our null and alternative hypotheses are so that we can determine the type of test. And then the p-value, when we're doing a two-sample test, this always uses t.test as an Excel command. All right, so again, we don't have to go through the usual process of computing sample statistics, finding your test statistic, and then using a .dist command to get your p-value. We do this all in a t.test command. So returning to our original statement, we're interested in whether nursing majors have the same mean score as exercise science majors, okay? So here's one way that you can write out your null and alternative hypotheses. So let's say nursing corresponds to population 1, exercise science corresponds to population 2, all right? Our null hypothesis is that these mean exam scores are equal in the population. So mu1 is actually equal to mu2. In other words, the nursing scores mu1 is equal to the nursing scores mu2. If you do it this way, make sure that you provide me a little key so I know which population is treated as which. Our alternative hypothesis then is that mu1 is not equal to mu2. Right? And as we remember from our previous work, or from our previous examples, if your claim is that you're not equal, this is a two-tailed test. And so for our tails argument in the t-test command, we're gonna set that equal to 2. So we can jump right to our p-value computation by using t.test. It asks for array 1, and array 1 is the column of scores associated to our nursing majors. So I'm going to use my shortcut trick where I essentially click into the top of my nursing scores, and then I use Control-Shift-Down to select the rest of them. Similarly, I can grab in array 2 the exercise science scores. And then for tails, I would do 2, because this is a two-tailed test. And for type, I would do 2. I forgot to write, this is two-tailed. This is a two-tailed test. So tails equals 2 in t.test command. Okay, so we can double check that everything's highlighted correctly. We should have our nursing scores highlighted in blue. Our second array should be in red, which is our exercise science scores. The tails equals 2, because this is a two-tailed test. And then our last argument, type, is always set to 2 for this class. So here we end up with a p-value of 0.19. So if you round this, it's 0.2. This is above our significance level. So we failed to reject H0. Okay? What this means is that we failed to provide sufficient evidence via our two samples that the population mean score for nursing majors is different than, let's make this left justified, same over here, is different than the population mean score for exercise science majors. Okay, so this is our final conclusion. We failed to provide evidence in support of our alternative hypothesis. Okay, so we failed to reject H0. H0 we have to presume is sort of true, right? Presumed innocence. We can't prove that it's true, but we couldn't provide evidence against it. And so what we see here is even though in our descriptive statistics, we have exercise science majors with a lower mean score on the sample level than nursing majors. And we can see little differences even in terms of our box plots. Essentially what our hypothesis testing is telling us is that those differences are not big enough, not significant enough to make a claim that there's a difference at the population level between these two majors in terms of this particular anatomy and physiology exam. Okay, so you may see some differences on the sample level, as evidenced by up here, but a hypothesis test is saying, are those differences significant, big enough, grand enough to warrant our belief that at the population level, there's a difference between these two populations in terms of their means. Okay, so we failed to provide sufficient evidence, that the population mean score for nursing majors is different than the population mean score for exercise science majors.